The Winter War by Priscilla Shirer with Gina Detweiler. Chapter 24, On the Beach. Xavier struggled to pull his books from his locker while leaning on his crutches. His knee throbbed. Sweat broke out on his forehead. It was his first day back at school since his surgery. He had never imagined how hard it would be to deal with the ordinary tasks of life. The doctor had warned him not to put any weight on his bad knee for at least 2 weeks. He had even told Xavier he should use a wheelchair. Xavier had refused. Now he wasn't sure he'd made the right choice. He didn't know how he would manage 2 weeks of this. "Hey, can I help you with those?" He glanced around and found himself looking into the eyes of Cassie Kavanaugh. He felt the heat rise in his cheeks and shook his head. "No, I got it," he said. "No, you don't," she said. She took the books from his locker and put them in his backpack for him. "I broke my arm once. Fell off a horse at camp. It is no fun." She smiled. Xavier looked quickly away from her and put the backpack over his shoulder. Then he situated his crutches again. "What's your next class?" Just at the end of the hall." "Great, it's on my way." They started to walk together through the crowd of kids, Cassie slowing to match his pace. Xavier saw a lot of kids stop and stare at him. He wondered what they were thinking. "So," said Cassie, "I meant to tell you that was a really great game until, well, you got hurt." "Oh, yeah." Xavier didn't like to be reminded about the game. Not that he could ever stop thinking about it. "Does it still hurt?" "Yeah, it hurts," he thought, "and not just physically." "Not as much as before." He paused. "I should have quit after I fell the first time. Then it might not have been so bad." It felt good to tell her this, to unburden himself of his nagging thought. What if he had just sat out the rest of the game, iced his knee, put his pride aside? Then maybe he would still be playing. He was hounded by the what-ifs these days. What if he had sat out the game? What if he had not gone over that bridge? "Are you going to the game tonight?" Xavier glanced at her, startled. "I wasn't planning to." "Why not?" "Well, because I can't play, so what's the point?" "So what if you can't play? I think you should still be there. You're part of the team, right? My dad always says that. When you're on the team no matter what." "I guess you're right." They had reached Xavier's classroom. Cassie turned to look directly into his eyes. "So I'll see you at the game?" "I guess so." "Good." She gave him another smile and walked away. Xavier didn't know what to make of Cassie Kavanaugh. He felt all mixed up inside whenever he talked to her. He sat through math class thinking about what she had said. As much as he hated going to the game and sitting on the bench, he knew Cassie was probably right. She had a point. It was the same thing Mr. J.R. had tried to tell him over the weekend. He still had a job to do. He was still on the team, even if it was from the sidelines. Besides, she would be there. So when his mom picked him up from school, he asked her if she would take him to the game that night. "I thought you said you didn't want to go to the games," his mom said as she drove him home. "Oh, I changed my mind." His mom didn't respond. She only smiled to herself. Xavier, wearing his team jacket, arrived in the locker room that night as the other players were getting into their uniforms. They gave him high fives and fist bumps. Coach Kavanaugh came in for the pep talk just before the team was to go out to the court. He saw Xavier and nodded. Xavier made his way into the gym with the team and took his place on the bench, setting his crutches underneath. The rest of the team went out on the court for warm-ups. Xavier rubbed his hands together, feeling awkward and lost. He had no idea what to do. He glanced up at the stands, searching for familiar faces. He saw his parents and Evan and gave a little wave. His dad raised one hand and pointed a finger at him. Xavier pointed back. He had told them not to bother to come since he wasn't playing, but they hadn't listened to him. He was kind of glad. He looked up to the top of the bleachers where Cassie was sitting with her friends. She smiled and waved. He smiled and turned around quickly, sure that his face was already bright red. He watched as the team gathered around the coach for one last pep talk. As the players broke up to start the game, the coach came over to him and patted his shoulder. "I am glad you're here, Blake," he said. "Thanks, Coach." Once the game started, it got easier. Xavier was soon absorbed in the battle on the court, watching everything the players did, noting the habits and strategies of the other team. He began to shout suggestions and encouragements, cheering when they made baskets. He was surprised at how different the game looked when he wasn't thinking about playing. He could see the bigger picture. He could read the plays before they happened and see when players weren't in their zones. At halftime, the team gathered for a huddle. They had been playing pretty hard but were down 7 points. Coach Kavanaugh talked about ways to put up a stronger defense against the other team's superior shooting ability. Then he turned to Xavier. "What do you think, Blake?" he asked. Xavier swallowed hard, surprised the coach was asking for his opinion. He was only a sophomore after all. "Try more bounce passes," he said finally. "They've got some tall guys, and there's been a lot of steals because you're trying to pass over their heads. So go under or around, or even between them. They're all up in the air, so you have to go low. Keep them guessing." Coach Cav smiled. "Good idea," he said. The Lions made a comeback in the second half and won the game by 3 points. The crowd in the stands went wild. Even though he hadn't played a single minute, Xavier felt like he'd had the best game of his life. His family came down to greet him. "Congratulations, son," said Mr. Blake, giving him a hug. "I am so proud of you." "I didn't even play." "I think you know what I mean. Mr. J.R. would be proud of you, too. He'd hoped to come, but he just wasn't up to it. Maybe you could call him and tell him what happened." "Sure," said Xavier. When he got home, Xavier called Mr. J.R. and told him about the game. "Good job, Xavier," was all Mr. J.R. said, but those 3 words meant so much to him. While he was trying to fall asleep that night, Xavier noticed a bright shaft of moonlight fall across the room and illuminate the stick he'd gotten from Ruach. He had almost forgotten about that stick. He got up and hopped over to it. He took hold of it in both hands. It didn't seem so much like a crutch to him now. Maybe it was meant for something else. Then he noticed a tiny crest engraved into the stick just above where his hands held it. He stared as the crest seemed to lift off the stick and hover in the air before him, glowing golden like a tiny star. He reached out and touched it.